I should have seen it coming. The late nights, the sudden urge to hit the gym, the way she started smiling at her phone more often than at me. But nothing could have prepared me for the shock of seeing that photo. It was a Saturday morning, one of those lazy weekends where nothing seemed to matter. Amy was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Absent-mindedly, I glanced at the screen. A message from Jack. Jack, our old friend. We'd known him for years. Hell, he was like a brother to me. I'd never thought twice about their friendship. Until now. I don't know what made me do it, but I picked up her phone. One swipe and there it was. A photo. A snapshot of Amy and Jack, her head resting on his shoulder, their faces too close, too intimate. They were at some bar, the dim lighting casting shadows that should have hidden them, but the closeness, the way she looked at him, it screamed something I hadn't wanted to believe. My stomach twisted as I stared at the image. I could feel the bile rising in my throat, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. I wanted to storm into the bathroom, confront her, and demand answers. But then something in me shifted. No, not like this. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think clearly. Confronting her would lead to an argument, tears, apologies, maybe even lies. She'd deny it, twist the truth until I doubted my own eyes. And Jack, he'd play the part of the concerned friend, acting like it was all just a misunderstanding. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a betrayal. I put her phone back on the counter, my mind already racing with ideas. If they wanted to play games, I'd make sure the stakes were higher than they could ever imagine. I wasn't just going to confront them, I was going to make them pay. And the best way to do that was to let them destroy themselves piece by piece in front of everyone they cared about. The shower stopped. I could hear Amy humming softly as she toweled off, completely unaware of the storm brewing on the other side of the door. I forced a smile when she emerged, her hair wrapped up in a towel, her skin glowing from the hot water. "Morning, babe," she said, planting a quick kiss on my cheek. "Morning," I replied, my voice calm, steady. She had no idea. Not yet. But soon, very soon, she and Jack would learn that betrayal comes with a price. And I would be there, watching as they paid it in full. I spent the next few days in a strange, surreal calm. Amy went about her usual routine, oblivious to the fact that I knew. She laughed at my jokes, kissed me goodnight, and whispered, "I love you," with the same sweetness she always had. But every time she said it, the words felt like poison seeping into my veins. I wasn't going to let her see me break. Not yet. The first step in my plan was to put them on edge and make them feel the same paranoia that gnawed at me. So, I arranged for a little surprise. It was a Friday night, and Amy told me she was going out with some friends from work. She made sure to mention that Jack wouldn't be there, as if that would set my mind at ease. I just nodded, acting as though I believed her. Meanwhile, I knew exactly where Jack would be. I had overheard Amy talking on the phone earlier in the week, setting up a meeting with Jack at a new restaurant downtown. They were planning to meet later in the evening, once Amy had said her goodbyes to her colleagues, so I decided to make a reservation at the same place. I arrived at the restaurant a little before they were scheduled to meet, choosing a table in the far corner, partially hidden by a large potted plant. I ordered a drink, something strong, and waited. It wasn't long before they walked in. Amy was wearing that black dress I always loved, the one that clung to her in all the right places. Jack looked sharp too, a little too sharp for just a casual dinner with a friend. They found a table near the window, laughing and talking as if they didn't have a care in the world. I watched them from the shadows, my anger bubbling beneath the surface. It took everything in me not to march over there and expose them right then and there. But no, this wasn't about a scene. This was about control, and I was going to make sure they danced to my tune. The waiter approached them with menus, and they started to settle in. That's when I made my move. I stood up, walked over to their table, and plastered a surprised smile on my face. "Jack, Amy, what a coincidence." Amy's face paled, and Jack's eyes widened in shock. They fumbled for words, clearly not expecting to see me there. "Michael," Jack finally managed to say, forcing a grin. "What are you doing here?" "Just grabbing a bite," I replied casually. "Didn't know you two were meeting up tonight. Mind if I join?" I didn't wait for an answer. I pulled up a chair and sat down, waving over a waiter before they could protest. "I'll have whatever they're having," I said, flashing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The next hour was pure torture for them. I made small talk, asked about work, and cracked jokes like nothing was wrong. But I could see it in their eyes, the nervous glances they exchanged, the way Amy's hands fidgeted with her napkin. They were uncomfortable, and that was exactly how I wanted them. By the time dinner was over, they looked like they'd been through the ringer. I paid the bill without hesitation, insisting it was my treat. "We should do this again sometime," I said cheerfully as we stood up to leave. You know, just the three of us. Amy forced a smile, her voice tight. Yeah, sure, Mike, that sounds great. But I could see the fear behind her eyes. She knew something was off, and that was just the beginning. As we walked out of the restaurant, I made sure to keep my tone light and friendly. But inside, I was already thinking about the next move. This wasn't just about catching them off guard. It was about building the tension, making them squirm till they couldn't take it anymore. They wanted to play games? Fine, but I was going to make sure they played by my rules. The morning after the restaurant encounter, the atmosphere at home was thick with unspoken tension. Amy was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to me when she thought I wasn't looking. She was trying to act normal, but I could see the cracks in her facade. It was just a matter of time before it all came crashing down. I wasn't going to rush it. My next move had to be precise and timed perfectly. I wanted her to feel the weight of every decision she had made, every lie she had told. A few days later, I got the perfect opportunity. Our mutual friend Rachel was throwing a party. She was one of those people who loved to gather everyone she knew under one roof, filling her house with laughter, drinks, and loud music. Amy loved Rachel's parties, and so did Jack. In fact, it was one of the few social events where I could be sure they would both be present without me having to lift a finger. Amy suggested we go, pretending everything was fine between us. I agreed, playing the role of the oblivious husband. She had no idea that I had something special planned. When we arrived at Rachel's house, the party was already in full swing. People were scattered across the living room, kitchen, and backyard, drinks in hand, laughing and chatting. Rachel greeted us at the door with her usual infectious enthusiasm, pulling us into the crowd. I spotted Jack almost immediately. He was leaning against the kitchen counter, a beer in hand, talking to some of our other friends. When he saw us, his smile faltered for just a split second before he recovered, raising his drink in greeting. "Hey guys," he called out, making his way over. "Glad you could make it." Amy shot me a quick glance, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course we wouldn't miss it," she said, slipping her arm through mine as if everything was perfectly fine. But I could feel the tension in her grip. We mingled with the crowd and exchanged pleasantries, and for a while it almost felt normal. Almost. Then, Rachel decided it was time for games. "All right, everyone," she shouted over the noise, clapping her hands to get our attention. "Let's do something fun. How about we play a little game?" There were groans and laughs from the group, but no one objected. Rachel had a way of getting everyone involved in her schemes. "What kind of game?" someone asked. Rachel grinned. "Let's do a trivia game. Couples versus couples. We'll see how well you really know each other." Amy stiffened beside me, and I knew this was it. The perfect moment to turn the screws a little tighter. "Sounds great," I said enthusiastically, earning a few cheers from the group. "Come on, Amy. Let's show them how it's done." She forced a smile, clearly uneasy, but she had no choice but to play along. We all gathered in the living room, forming teams. Rachel handed out notepads and pens, explaining the rules. One partner would answer questions about the other, and we'd see how many matches we could get. The game started off lighthearted enough. The questions were simple at first: favorite color, favorite food, that sort of thing. Amy and I answered easily, falling into a rhythm. But as the questions got more personal, the tension between us grew. "What's your partner's biggest fear?" Rachel asked. I scribbled down my answer quickly. "Losing control." When Amy revealed her answer, it matched. A nervous chuckle escaped her lips, but I didn't miss the way her hands trembled slightly as she held up the notepad. "Next question. What's your partner's biggest regret?" I wrote down my answer without hesitation: not being honest. Amy's smile faltered when she saw it, and her answer didn't match. Instead, she'd written something generic about missing out on a job opportunity. I could see the doubt creeping into her mind, the worry that I knew more than I was letting on. And that was exactly what I wanted. Finally, the last question came, and it was the one I had been waiting for. "Who's the person your partner trusts the most?" Amy hesitated for a moment before writing down her answer. When she revealed it, she had written my name. The room was quiet, everyone watching with interest. I held up my notepad, and the words I'd written were simple but devastating: "Not me." The silence that followed was deafening. Amy's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. Around us, the atmosphere shifted. People exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the tension that suddenly filled the room. Rachel, ever the peacemaker, tried to laugh it off. "All right, folks, that's enough for tonight. Let's get back to the party." But the damage was done. Amy knew I was onto her, and so did Jack. As the night went on, they kept their distance from me, their laughter forced, their smiles strained. I watched them, knowing that this was just the beginning. The cracks in their facade were growing wider, and soon, it would all come crashing down. And when it did, I'd be there to pick up the pieces one by one, savoring every moment of their fall. The party at Rachel's had rattled Amy and Jack, but they were still trying to hold on to their secret. I could see it in their eyes, how they clung to the hope that I was just suspicious, that I didn't really know. But I was done playing nice. It was time to turn up the heat. A few days after the party, I found my next opportunity. Amy had recently started going to a new gym, a place Jack just happened to frequent as well. She'd been raving about the workouts, how they were helping her clear her mind and stay fit. I pretended to be supportive, even enthusiastic, but in reality, I was waiting for the right moment to make my move. That moment came one afternoon when Amy left for the gym, claiming she had a private session with her trainer. I knew better. I had done my research, talked to a few people, and found out that Jack often scheduled his workouts around the same time. The odds of them bumping into each other were too convenient to ignore, so I decided to pay the gym a visit myself. I arrived about 20 minutes after Amy left, making sure I wouldn't run into her on the way. The gym was one of those trendy spots with glass walls, sleek equipment, and an air of exclusivity. I walked in as if I belonged there, flashing a smile at the receptionist and heading straight for the free weights area. It didn't take long to spot them. Amy and Jack were near the back, both dressed in their workout gear. They were chatting casually between sets, but there was a familiarity in their body language that spoke volumes. Jack's hand lingered on her arm a little too long, and Amy's smile was just a little too warm. They didn't see me at first. I kept my distance, pretending to be engrossed in my own workout while keeping an eye on them. I watched as they laughed, exchanged inside jokes, and gave each other looks that made my blood boil. Then I made my move. I grabbed a towel from the rack and strolled over to their area, making sure they saw me before I spoke. "Hey, you two," I called out cheerfully, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "Fancy seeing you here." Their reactions were priceless. Amy's eyes widened in shock, and she nearly dropped the dumbbell she was holding. Jack froze mid-rep, his face turning an interesting shade of pale. For a moment they were both speechless, clearly trying to process my sudden appearance. "Michael," Amy finally managed to say, her voice a little too high-pitched. What are you doing here?" "Decided to switch up my routine," I replied smoothly, keeping my expression neutral. "Thought I'd check out this place. Didn't expect to run into you guys though." "Yeah, das small world," Jack muttered, trying to force a smile. But his discomfort was obvious. He avoided my gaze, focusing on putting down the weights with exaggerated care. I glanced between the two of them, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm. "So you guys work out together often?" I asked casually, as if it were the most innocent question in the world. Amy hesitated, and I could see her mind racing for an excuse. "Oh no, not really," she said too quickly. "We just ran into each other today. Total coincidence." "Right," I said, drawing out the word. "Well, it's good to stay in shape, keeps you sharp, alert." The double meaning wasn't lost on them. Amy's smile faltered, and Jack shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. They knew I was playing a game, but they still didn't know the rules. "Anyway," I continued as if nothing was wrong, "I'll let you two get back to it. Maybe I'll see you around more often. Seems like this place is pretty popular." With that, I gave them a nod and walked away, feeling their eyes on my back the entire time. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, the questions they were too afraid to ask. I didn't look back, but I knew the damage had been done. Their little gym rendezvous was no longer their secret escape. Now, every time they met, they'd be looking over their shoulders, wondering if I was watching. And that uncertainty, that fear, was exactly what I wanted. Back at home, Amy was quieter than usual. She tried to act normal, but her smiles were forced, her conversation strained. Jack, on the other hand, started to avoid me altogether, canceling plans and finding excuses not to be around. It was clear that my presence was getting under their skin. And that was just the beginning. I could feel the tension between them growing, and it was only a matter of time before their perfect little affair started to unravel. They thought they could keep their secrets safe, but I was always one step ahead, ready to expose them whenever I saw fit. The gym encounter had shaken their confidence. Now it was time to push them even further, until there was no place left for them to hide. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The next step in my plan came in the form of a barbecue. It was one of those neighborhood get-togethers that I used to enjoy, a chance to relax with friends, crack open a few beers, and forget about the stress of work. But this time, I had a different kind of satisfaction in mind. The barbecue was hosted by Tom, a guy who lived a few houses down from us. He was the kind of neighbor who loved to entertain, a big, friendly guy with a booming laugh and a knack for grilling the perfect steak. He invited everyone on the block, and of course, that included Amy, Jack, and me. When Amy told me about the barbecue, she hesitated, like she was expecting me to find an excuse not to go. But I could see the nervousness in her eyes, the uncertainty about what I might do if I did go. So, naturally, I said yes. The day of the barbecue was sunny and warm, the kind of afternoon that begged for outdoor gatherings. I could hear the sizzle of meat on the grill and the sound of laughter as we walked up to Tom's backyard. The smell of barbecue sauce and charcoal filled the air, mixing with the chatter of neighbors catching up after a long work week. Amy stuck close to me as we made our way through the crowd, greeting people and making small talk. I could feel her tension, the way her eyes kept scanning the yard as if she was bracing for something to happen. And then it did. Jack arrived about 20 minutes after we did. I watched him as he came through the gate, trying to act casually like he hadn't been dreading this moment. His eyes flicked to me, then to Amy, and I could see the unease beneath his friendly smile. I made sure to be the first to greet him. "Jack, good to see you, man," I called out, clapping him on the back like we were old pals. Jack forced a grin, trying to match my enthusiasm. "Hey Michael, how's it going?" "Oh, just enjoying the day," I replied, my tone light. "You should grab a drink. Tom's got some great stuff on tap." As Jack moved through the crowd, I could see him trying to navigate the situation. He avoided standing too close to Amy and kept his distance, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. They were nervous and careful, like two teenagers caught in a lie. They didn't know how to act, and that made them even more obvious. Perfect. After a while, the party was in full swing. Tom had everyone gathered around the grill, dishing out plates of food, while people sat in groups on lawn chairs laughing and chatting. I waited until everyone was settled before I made my next move. Tom's wife Jessica was a bit of a gossip. She loved knowing everything about everyone, and she had a way of digging for information without people even realizing it. I found her by the cooler, sipping on a glass of wine and chatting with a couple of neighbors. "Hey Jessica," I said, pulling up a chair next to her. "Having a good time?" "Oh, always," she replied with a smile. "You know Tom, he lives for these barbecues." We talked for a few minutes, just the usual small talk before I casually steered the conversation in the direction I wanted. "Hey, did you know Jack and Amy have been working out together at the gym lately?" I asked, my tone light and conversational. Jessica's eyes lit up with interest. "Oh really? I had no idea they were so close." "Yeah," I said, leaning back in my chair. "They've been spending a lot of time together lately. Makes you wonder if there's something more going on, I watched as the seed I planted took root in Jessica's mind. She glanced over at Jack and Amy, who were on opposite sides of the yard, both trying a little too hard to avoid each other. Jessica's curiosity was piqued, and I knew she wouldn't be able to resist digging a little deeper. By the end of the afternoon, the whispers had started. I could see people glancing at Amy and Jack, the way conversations shifted when they walked by. It wasn't anything overt, just subtle, lingering looks and hushed tones. But it was enough. Amy could feel it too. I saw the way her smile grew more strained as the afternoon wore on, how she started checking her phone more frequently, her fingers tapping out nervous messages. Jack, on the other hand, looked like he was ready to bolt at any moment, his eyes darting around like a hunted animal. As the sun began to set, Tom announced that it was time for dessert, and everyone started gathering around the table where Jessica had set up a spread of pies and cakes. Amy and Jack both found excuses to hang back, keeping their distance from the crowd. They thought they were being discreet, but all it did was make them look guiltier. I joined the group by the dessert table, chatting with Tom and a few others while keeping an eye on Amy and Jack. They were on the outskirts, watching nervously as Jessica whispered something to one of the neighbors, who then passed it on to another. The ripple effect was in full motion. Finally, Amy couldn't take it anymore. She walked over to me, her face pale, and whispered, "Michael, can we leave? I'm not feeling well." I gave her a concerned look, playing the role of the supportive husband. "Of course, honey. Let me just say goodbye to Tom." As we left the party, I could feel the weight of the stairs on our backs. Amy was tense, her silence heavy, and I knew she was trying to figure out what had gone wrong, but she wouldn't ask. Not yet. In the car, the silence between us was deafening. I kept my eyes on the road, driving us home with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside me. Amy stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing with questions she was too afraid to voice. As we pulled into the driveway, I finally broke the silence. "You seemed uncomfortable at the barbecue. Everything okay?" She hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." I nodded, not pressing further. Let her stew in it, I thought, let her wonder. Because this was only the beginning. The whispers would spread, the doubts would grow, and soon enough their world would start to crumble around them. and I would be there, watching every piece fall into place. As we stepped inside the house, I couldn't help but smile. This was my game now, and they were both trapped in it, whether they knew it or not. The fallout from the barbecue lingered in the days that followed. Amy was quieter than ever, constantly distracted, and I could tell she was replaying the events in her mind, trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong. Jack, meanwhile, had gone radio silent. No texts, no calls, nothing. They were both on edge, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure became too much. But I wasn't done yet. The next phase of my plan involved a visit to Jack's office. Jack worked at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown, and from what I'd heard, he was well liked by his colleagues. Charismatic, funny, the kind of guy who could make friends easily, but that also made him vulnerable. In an office setting, people notice things, little details, changes in behavior. All it took was the right nudge, and the rumors would spread like wildfire. So one afternoon, I decided to pay Jack a little visit. I made sure to go during his lunch break, when I knew most of the office would be milling around the break room or heading out for a bite to eat. I dressed the part too, business casual, like I had just stepped out of a meeting. I didn't want to draw attention by looking out of place. When I arrived at the office, I was greeted by a cheerful receptionist who asked if I had an appointment. "No, but I'm a friend of Jack's," I said with a friendly smile. "I thought I'd surprise him for lunch. Do you know if he's around?" The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I think he's in his office. Let me call him for you." As she picked up the phone, I couldn't help but glance around the lobby. It was a modern, sleek space with glass walls and minimalistic decor. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, perfect for what I had in mind. After a brief conversation, the receptionist smiled at me again. "He's just wrapping up a meeting. You can head back. His office is down the hall on the right." I thanked her and made my way down the hallway, feeling the anticipation building with each step. When I reached Jack's office, I knocked lightly on the door and waited. "Come in," came his voice from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped in, catching Jack mid-sentence as he ended a phone call. The moment he saw me, his face froze. For a second, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Michael, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to mask the shock in his voice. "Just thought I'd drop by," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Wanted to see how you're doing after the barbecue? You seemed a little off." Jack forced a laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind, I guess. You know how it is." I nodded, stepping further into the office. "Sure, I get it. Stress can do that to you. But I've been meaning to talk to you about something." Jack's eyes darted to the door, then back to me, clearly uneasy. "Oh, what's that?" I let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "I've noticed that you and Amy have been spending a lot of time together. Gyms, social events, the usual stuff. It's nice to have close friends, but it's starting to get people talking." His face went pale, and I could see the panic rising in his eyes. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. "Just that people notice things. The way you two interact, the way you avoid each other when you think someone's watching. It raises eyebrows, you know?" Jack swallowed hard, his composure slipping. "Michael, I swear there's nothing going on between Amy and me. We're just friends, that's all." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sure that's what you tell yourself. But people aren't blind, Jack, and neither am I." He stared at me, at a loss for words, and I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. The fear was written all over his face, the realization that his carefully constructed world was starting to fall apart. Before he could respond, the door to his office swung open, and one of his colleagues poked her head in. "Jack, we're heading out for lunch. You coming?" She paused when she saw me, her gaze flicking between Jack and me, curiosity sparking in her eyes. Jack forced a smile, trying to regain his composure. Yeah, I'll be right there." "Great," she said, lingering for a moment before retreating, but not before giving me a curious glance. I could tell she was wondering who I was and what our conversation was about. When the door closed behind her, I turned back to Jack. "You know, it's funny how quickly word spreads in places like this. One little piece of gossip, and suddenly everyone knows. Just something to think about." Jack clenched his jaw, trying to keep his anger in check. "Michael, what are you trying to do here?" I met his gaze, my expression cold. "Just giving you a heads up. Be careful, Jack. You wouldn't want things to get messy." With that, I turned and walked out of his office, leaving him standing there, speechless and terrified. As I made my way back through the lobby, I noticed a few of his colleagues glancing my way, their curiosity piqued. By the time I got to my car, I knew the seeds had been planted. Jack would spend the next few days paranoid, watching every interaction with his coworkers, wondering who might have overheard something, who might be talking about him behind his back. The stress would eat at him, and eventually it would start to show, and when it did, it would only take one more push to send everything crashing down. As I drove home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and soon enough Jack and Amy would have no place left to hide. The next event I had planned was a game night at Stephen's house. Stephen was a mutual friend of ours, someone who had been part of our social circle for years. He was a laid-back guy, always up for a good time, and he hosted these game nights every month or so, where a group of us would get together, drink some beers, and play everything from board games to poker. This particular game night was one I couldn't miss. It was another chance to let the whispers grow louder, to see how much more strain I could put on Amy and Jack. Stephen, of course, had no idea what was going on beneath the surface. To him, it was just another fun night with friends. But for me, it was an opportunity to push things further. Amy seemed reluctant when I brought up the game night. She hesitated, then asked, "Do we really have to go? I've had a long week and I'm just tired." I knew why she didn't want to go. After the barbecue and the office visit, she was feeling the weight of the tension, the fear of being exposed. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook. "Come on, it'll be fun," I said with a smile. "You could use a break. Besides, everyone's expecting us." She finally agreed, though her enthusiasm was clearly forced. As we got ready to leave, I noticed the way she kept checking her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as if she was debating whether to text Jack. She didn't, but the temptation was there, and I could see it in her eyes. When we arrived at Stephen's house, the night was already in full swing. The living room was filled with laughter and the clatter of dice on a board. Stephen greeted us at the door, a beer in hand, and ushered us inside. The usual suspects were there, friends we had known for years, people who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Jack was there too, sitting on the couch with a drink, trying his best to act casual. He looked up when we walked in, his eyes meeting mine for a brief second before he quickly looked away. I could see the tension in his posture, and the way he kept fidgeting with his drink. Amy avoided his gaze entirely, sticking close to me as we made our way into the room. As the night progressed, we settled into the usual rhythm of jokes, trash talk, and friendly competition. Stephen broke out a deck of cards, and we all gathered around the table for a few rounds of poker. The banter flowed easily, but I kept my eyes on Jack and Amy, watching their every move. They were trying so hard not to interact, not to draw attention to themselves. But that in itself made them stand out. It was too obvious, the way they avoided sitting next to each other, the way their conversations with everyone else seemed forced. And the others were starting to notice. It didn't take long for the tension to bubble over. During one of the rounds, Stephen made an offhand comment about how quiet Jack was being. "You're usually the loudest one here," he teased. "What's going on, man? You got something on your mind?" Jack forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Just tired, I guess." Stephen grinned, not letting it go. "Or maybe you're just trying to hide a bad poker face. Come on, spill it, what's bothering you?" Jack shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Amy for a split second before he quickly looked down at his cards. "Nothing, really." It was a small moment, but it was enough to catch everyone's attention. The room grew quieter as people exchanged glances, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Amy stiffened next to me, her hand gripping her drink a little too tightly. I saw my opening. "Maybe he's just distracted," I said with a casual smile, looking directly at Jack. We all know how life can get complicated sometimes. Jack's eyes shot up to meet mine, and I could see the panic flash across his face. He knew exactly what I was implying, and so did Amy. The silence in the room grew heavier, the atmosphere thick with tension. Stephen, sensing the awkwardness, quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. The rest of the night was a blur of forced smiles and half-hearted attempts at conversation. Jack barely spoke after that, and Amy looked like she was about to break at any moment. By the time we finally left, the strain between them was palpable. As we drove home, Amy was unusually quiet, staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes. I didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between us, knowing that her mind was racing. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael, do you ever feel like everything's falling apart?" I turned to look at her, pretending to consider her words. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind, I'm just tired." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but inside I knew exactly what she meant. She could feel it too, the slow unraveling of the life she had tried so hard to keep together. The guilt, the lies, the fear of being found out, it was all starting to catch up with her, and it was only going to get worse. As I watched her walk into the house, her shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The cracks were widening, and soon enough, everything would come crashing down around her and Jack. They thought they could get away with it. They thought they could keep their secret hidden. But they had underestimated me, and now, they were paying the price. After the tension of game night, I could feel things escalating. Amy's nerves were fraying, and Jack was barely holding it together. But I wasn't done yet. The next step in my plan involved something a little more public: a golf outing with our closest friends. Golf was Jack's thing. He loved the game and often organized these weekend outings where a few of us would head to the local country club, play a few rounds, and enjoy the day. It was his escape, a place where he could unwind and let his guard down. That made it the perfect setting for my next move. I made sure to keep everything casual. When I brought it up to Amy, she seemed hesitant, but I insisted it would be a good distraction. "It'll be nice to get out of the house and clear our heads," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Reluctantly, she agreed. On the day of the outing, the weather was perfect, clear skies and just the right amount of breeze. The kind of day that would normally put everyone in a good mood. But as we arrived at the club and saw Jack waiting by the entrance, I could sense the tension in the air. Amy kept her sunglasses on, even though it wasn't that bright out, and Jack greeted us with a strained smile. We joined the others, making small talk as we grabbed our gear and headed out to the course. It was a mixed group of guys and a few wives who had tagged along to enjoy the day. The atmosphere was light and easy, but I could tell that both Amy and Jack were on edge, their interactions carefully controlled. As we started the game, I made sure to keep the pressure on Jack. I joked about his swings and nudged him about his missed shots, all with that same easy smile that masked my true intentions. He laughed along, but I could see the cracks in his facade. The tension was eating away at him, and I knew it wouldn't take much to push him over the edge. By the time we reached the 9th hole, I decided it was time to drop the next bomb. We had split into smaller groups for this part of the course, and it just so happened that Jack, Amy, and I ended up in the same group with another friend, Paul. We teed off, and as we walked down the fairway, I casually brought up the topic of relationships. "Marriage can be tricky, can't it?" I said, keeping my tone light. "You think you know someone, and then things could change." Jack shot me a nervous glance, and I could see Amy stiffen beside him. Paul, oblivious to the subtext, chuckled. "Yeah, you never really know what's going on behind closed doors, right?" I nodded, then turned to Jack. "What do you think, Jack? Any secrets we should know about?" His face drained of color, and he fumbled with his golf bag, trying to stay composed. I don't know what you mean." I smiled, letting the silence hang in the air. Paul looked between us, sensing the shift in mood but unsure of what was happening. Amy's grip tightened on her club, her knuckles white. "Just saying," I continued, my voice calm, "that sometimes people have a way of hiding things, but eventually the truth comes out. Doesn't it?" Jack swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me and Amy. He knew what I was doing, and he was powerless to stop it. The silence stretched on, thick with tension, until Paul finally broke it with an awkward laugh. "Okay, enough with the deep talk. Let's focus on the game." The rest of the round passed in a blur of forced conversation and strained smiles. By the time we reached the clubhouse, I could see the exhaustion in both Amy and Jack's faces. They were barely holding on, and I knew it wouldn't take much more to break them. After we finished the game, we all gathered at the clubhouse for drinks. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the course, but the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. As we sat around the table, I noticed a few of our friends exchanging curious glances, clearly picking up on the tension between Amy and Jack. And that's when I decided to give things one final push. "Great game today," I said, raising my glass. "But you know what's even better? Trust. The kind of trust you can count on, both on and off the course." Jack nearly choked on his drink, and Amy's eyes widened behind her sunglasses. Our friends looked at me, puzzled, but I just smiled and took a sip of my beer. Paul, always the one to keep things light, tried to laugh it off. "Deep thoughts today, Michael. Maybe you should stick to golf." Everyone chuckled, but the unease lingered. Jack and Amy avoided each other's gaze, and I could see the cracks widening, the weight of their secret becoming unbearable. As the evening wound down, we all started to say our goodbyes. Jack was one of the first to leave, making a quick excuse about needing to get home. Amy and I followed shortly after, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. When we got to the car, Amy finally spoke. "What are you doing, Michael?" I turned to her, feigning innocence. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," she said, her voice trembling. "Why are you pushing this? Why are you doing this?" I looked at her, letting the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "Because, Amy, secrets have a way of coming out, and maybe it's time for yours to see the light of day." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew what was happening, and we both knew there was no turning back. As I started the car and drove away from the country club, I could feel the satisfaction growing inside me. The walls were closing in on Jack and Amy, and it wouldn't be long before everything collapsed around them. And when it did, I'd be there to watch it all burn. The final blow was going to be at a dinner party. It wasn't just any dinner party, it was a gathering at the home of our oldest friends, Chris and Megan. They were the glue that held our friend group together, the kind of couple that everyone looked up to. If there was a place to shatter Amy and Jack's world completely, it was here, in front of everyone who mattered to them. I made sure Amy and I would attend. Chris had reached out to us weeks ago with an invitation, and I didn't hesitate to accept. Amy, on the other hand, was growing more and more withdrawn. The tension between us had reached a boiling point, and she was avoiding eye contact, her words clipped and distant. But I knew she wouldn't back out of this. Not when everyone would be there. The night of the party, Amy dressed carefully, as if trying to put on armor for the night. She wore a dark green dress that I used to love on her, but now it just seemed like another facade. I noticed the way she hesitated before putting on her jewelry, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't say anything, just watched as she pulled herself together. When we arrived at Chris and Megan's house, the place was already buzzing with conversation and laughter. The smell of roasted meats and fresh bread filled the air, and the clinking of glasses echoed through the warmly lit rooms. Megan greeted us with her usual exuberance, pulling us into hugs and ushering us into the living room where everyone was gathered. Jack was there, of course, standing with a drink in his hand, trying to blend into the background. But there was no blending in tonight, not for him. As the evening went on, the atmosphere was relaxed, full of the usual banter and catching up. But beneath the surface I could feel the tension building. Amy was quiet, too quiet, and Jack kept glancing in her direction, his unease palpable. Our friends noticed the awkwardness between them, but no one said anything. Not yet. Megan, always the gracious host, announced dinner, and we all moved to the long dining table that was set with candles and polished silverware. The food was beautiful, the conversation lively, but my mind was focused on the moment I had been waiting for. As the dinner wound down and dessert was served, I decided it was time to light the match. "So," I said, my voice carrying over the soft hum of conversation, "how's everyone's year been? Anything unexpected happen?" The question was innocent enough, but I saw the way Amy froze, her fork pausing mid-air. Jack looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in his slice of pie. Chris, always quick to engage, started talking about a trip he and Megan had taken, but I wasn't done. I turned to Jack, my smile tight. "What about you, Jack? Anything new in your life?" The table grew quiet, and everyone looked at him. Jack's face went pale, and he opened his mouth, but no words came out. Amy stared at her plate, her hands clenched in her lap. Megan, ever the hostess, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Jack's always busy with work, right? What's the latest case you're working on?" But I didn't let it go. "Work's not everything though, is it, Jack? Sometimes, other things take priority." I could feel the tension thickening. The curiosity of our friends peaked. They were waiting for him to say something, anything, but Jack was trapped. I had him right where I wanted him. Finally, he cleared his throat, trying to muster up some semblance of composure. No, nothing really, just the usual." I smiled, leaning back in my chair. "Funny because I've heard some things lately." "Interesting things." Amy's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Jack shot me a warning look, but it was too late. The room was silent now, all eyes on us. Chris frowned, glancing between me and Jack. "What's going on, Michael?" I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Oh, nothing much, just, I've been hearing rumors and, well, you know how small our circle is. Word gets around." Megan looked confused. "Rumors? About what?" I let the silence stretch, enjoying the tension, before finally turning my gaze to Amy. "About things that happen when people think no one's watching." Amy's face turned ashen, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "Michael," Chris said, his voice cautious, "what are you trying to say?" I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each person there. Friends we had known for years, people who had been part of our lives for so long. And then I looked back at Jack and Amy, who were now visibly crumbling under the weight of their guilt. "What I'm trying to say," I said slowly, "is that trust is a fragile thing, and once it's broken it's nearly impossible to put back together." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the realization began to dawn on everyone around the table. I could see the shock, the disbelief, the questions forming in their minds. Megan's hand flew to her mouth, Chris stared at Jack in stunned silence, and the others exchanged uneasy glances. Amy broke first. She pushed back her chair and bolted from the table, tears streaming down her face. Jack hesitated, looking like he wanted to disappear, but eventually he got up and followed her out of the room. The door slammed behind them, and the sound echoed through the now silent house. No one said anything for a long time. The shock of what had just happened was too much to process. Finally, Chris spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true, Michael? Did TA?" I nodded, my expression calm, but inside I was savoring every second of this moment. "Yes, it's true." Megan shook her head, disbelief written all over her face. "I can't believe it. How long?" "Long enough," I replied, my voice steady. "Long enough for them to think they could get away with it." The room was heavy with the weight of betrayal, and I could see the cracks forming in our friendships, the way everything was shifting. Amy and Jack were finished in this group. There was no coming back from this. As I left Chris and Megan's house that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also a deep emptiness. I had achieved what I set out to do, destroyed their reputation and exposed their betrayal. But now that it was done, I was left with the aftermath, with the wreckage of what had once been my life. Amy and Jack had lost everything, and in a way so had I, but at least now I could start over, free from the lies, free from the pain. As I drove away, the cool night air washing over me, I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. It was over. The morning after the dinner party, the house was eerily quiet. I woke up early, as I had been doing for the past few weeks, unable to shake the heavy feeling that had settled in my chest. The satisfaction I had felt last night, the sense of vindication, of finally exposing Amy and Jack for what they were, had faded, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. Amy wasn't in bed beside me. I wasn't surprised. She had been avoiding me since the night before when everything came crashing down. I could hear the faint sounds of movement downstairs, the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. She was probably trying to keep herself busy, to distract herself from the reality of what had happened. I got up and dressed slowly, my mind replaying the events of the night before. The looks on our friends' faces when they realized the truth, the way Amy had bolted from the room, tears streaming down her face. Jack's shame, his silence. It was all still fresh, vivid in my mind. When I finally made my way downstairs, I found Amy at the kitchen counter, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. She didn't acknowledge me as I walked in, her shoulders hunched as if she was trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. "Morning," I said, my voice flat. She didn't respond, just kept staring at her coffee. I leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment before speaking again. "So, what now?" Amy flinched at the question, her fingers tightening around the cup. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't know what to do." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. This was the moment we had been avoiding for so long, the moment where we had to face the reality of what our marriage had become. "Maybe it's time to figure it out," I said quietly. "Because we can't keep doing this." She finally looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. There was no anger in her gaze, no defiance, just a deep, aching sadness. "Michael, I'm sorry, for everything." The apology felt empty, too little too late, but I nodded anyway, not because I forgave her but because there was nothing else to say. We had reached the end of the line and we both knew it. "I think," Amy hesitated, her voice trembling. "I think it's best if I leave, at least for a while." I didn't argue. In fact, I had been expecting it. "Maybe that's for the best," I replied. "We need space, to figure out where we go from here." She nodded, looking down at her coffee again. The silence stretched on, and I could feel the finality of the moment settling over us like a heavy blanket. After a few minutes, Amy stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'll pack some things," she said softly. "I won't be long." I watched her walk out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. I didn't follow her. Instead, I sat down at the table, staring at the cup of coffee she had left behind, the steam still rising from it. This was it, the end of our marriage, of everything we had built together over the years. I had wanted this, hadn't I? I had wanted to expose her, to make her pay for what she had done, and I had succeeded. But now that it was over, I wasn't sure how to feel. There was no satisfaction in watching her pack her bags, no sense of victory as she walked out the door. Just a deep, gnawing emptiness that seemed to consume everything in its path. As the door closed behind her, the silence of the house grew even more oppressive. I was alone now, truly alone, with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. And in that silence, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. I had destroyed my marriage, and in doing so, I had destroyed a part of myself. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Chris. I hesitated before opening it, bracing myself for whatever he had to say. "Chris, hey man, just checking in. Last night was rough. If you need anything, we're here for you." I stared at the message for a long time, not sure how to respond. The fallout from last night was going to linger for a long time, among our friends, among our community. Amy and Jack were outcasts now, and I had played a big part in that. But had it really been worth it? I finally typed out a response, keeping it short and to the point. Me, thanks Chris, I appreciate it. I put the phone down and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The weight of everything pressed down on me, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the pain, the loss, the grief. It was going to be a long road ahead. But at least now, there were no more secrets, no more lies, just the raw, unfiltered truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. In the weeks that followed Amy's departure, the house felt emptier than ever. It wasn't just the absence of her physical presence, it was the silence that came with it. No more half-hearted conversations, no more pretending that everything was fine, just quiet, echoing through every room. At first I thought I'd welcome the peace, that it would give me time to process everything. But as the days dragged on, I found myself struggling with the weight of it all. The satisfaction I had felt from exposing Amy and Jack had long since faded, leaving behind a sense of emptiness that I couldn't shake. Kept busy, throwing myself into work, trying to distract myself with mundane tasks around the house. But no matter how hard I tried, the thoughts always crept back in. What now? What comes after everything falls apart? One afternoon I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. It was something Amy and I used to do together, back when things were still good between us. We'd stroll through the tree-lined streets, talking about everything and nothing, planning our future. That future was gone now, replaced by a blank slate that I didn't know how to fill. As I walked, I passed by the park where we used to sit and watch the kids play. The playground was empty now, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty seats, remembering how we'd talked about having kids of our own someday. Another dream that had slipped away. I continued on, my thoughts wandering. The neighborhood felt different now, like a place I didn't quite belong in anymore. The people I passed seemed distant, as if they knew what had happened, and didn't quite know how to react. The scandal had spread quickly, and I could feel the judgment in their glances, the whispers that followed me. But maybe that was just my own guilt talking. After all, I had been the one to expose everything. I had been the one to set the events in motion that had led to this. When I got back home, I found a package on the doorstep. It was from Amy. She had left a note inside along with the keys to the house. "Michael, I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I wanted you to have these. The house should be yours. I won't fight you on it. I'm staying with my sister for now. Maybe one day we can talk, but I understand if you don't want that. Take care of yourself. Amy." I stared at the note for a long time, my emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite define. I'd been expecting a fight, some sort of confrontation about what would happen next. But this was too easy. It felt like she was giving up, like she had accepted that this was the end. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. In the following days I started to make changes. I cleared out the remnants of our life together, packing away the photos, the little mementos that reminded me of what we used to be. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and tried to make the space feel like mine again. It was a slow process, but with each step I felt a little bit lighter. I also reached out to Chris and Megan. They had been supportive since the dinner party, checking in on me, and making sure I wasn't drowning in my own thoughts. We met for coffee one afternoon, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I talked about the future. Not the one I had planned with Amy, but the one that was still unwritten. "I'm thinking of taking some time off work," I told them, sipping my coffee. "Maybe do some traveling. Get away from here for a while." Megan smiled gently. "That sounds like a good idea. Sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what you need to clear your head." Chris nodded in agreement. "You've been through a lot, man. It's okay to take some time for yourself." I appreciated their support, but I knew this was something I had to do on my own. I needed to figure out who I was without Amy, without the weight of the past dragging me down. And that wasn't going to happen if I stayed in this town, surrounded by reminders of everything that had happened. So I started planning. I wasn't sure where I was going yet. Maybe the coast, maybe somewhere I had never been before. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was moving forward, taking steps towards something new. As I packed my bags, I found myself thinking about the future in a way that didn't feel so daunting anymore. There was still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions that didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't running away from my past, I was leaving it behind. There was a difference. On the day I left, I stood on the porch of the house one last time, taking in the view. This place had been the center of my life for so long, the foundation of everything I had built with Amy. But now it was just a house, a place I used to live, a chapter that was closing. I locked the door behind me and walked away, the sun warm on my face as I stepped into the unknown. It was time to start over, and for the first time that didn't scare me. A few months later I found myself back in town, standing outside the cafe where it all began. The air was cooler now, the crispness of autumn replacing the summer heat that had once weighed everything down. The leaves had turned, painting the streets in shades of orange and gold, and the town looked different somehow, less suffocating, more distant. The time away had done me good. I had spent weeks driving along the coast, stopping in small towns, meeting new people, and most importantly, clearing my head. The pain and anger that had consumed me had started to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. I knew now that what had happened wasn't something I could change. All I could do was move forward. But before I could fully do that, I needed to close the final chapter of this story. That was why I was back. I pushed open the door to the cafe and stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods hit me immediately, a familiar scent that brought back memories of happier times. This place hadn't changed much, same worn wooden tables, same chalkboard menu hanging on the wall, but the energy was different. Or maybe it was just me. I spotted Amy sitting in the corner, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker of something in her expression, recognition, maybe even regret. But she quickly looked away, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Michael," she said softly as I sat down across from her. Her voice was tentative, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to say my name anymore. "Amy," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. There was no point in dragging up the past, we both knew what had happened. This wasn't about rehashing old wounds. For a few moments we sat in silence, the noise of the cafe bustling around us. I could tell she was nervous, her gaze flitting between me and the window as if she was looking for an escape. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," she finally said, breaking the silence. "I wasn't sure if you would." I nodded, keeping my hands folded on the table. "I wasn't sure either, but I think it's time we talk." She swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. "You're right, we never really dealt with everything. I just left. And I'm sorry for that." There was genuine remorse in her voice, and for the first time, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. This had been hard on both of us in different ways, but while I had been dealing with my own pain, I hadn't really thought about what she had been going through. Not that it excused her actions, but it made her more human to me. "Leaving was probably for the best," I said after a moment. "We both needed space, time to figure things out." Amy nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, sadness, guilt, and maybe even relief. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since then. About what happened, about us. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I regret it. Hurting you like that. It wasn't fair, to either of us." I appreciated her honesty, but I wasn't here to apologize, I was here for closure. "I've come to terms with it," I said. "It wasn't easy, but I've accepted that we both made mistakes. Things were broken long before Jack came into the picture." She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "Yeah, they were. I guess I just didn't want to see eye." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. "So what now? Where do we go from here?" Amy looked up at me, her expression conflicted. "I don't know, Michael. I've been trying to figure that out. I know we can't go back to the way things were, but I also don't want to leave things like this, unresolved." Her words echoed the thoughts I had been having for weeks. This meeting wasn't about reconciliation, it was about finding a way to move on without the weight of the past dragging us down. "I don't want us to be enemies, Amy," I said quietly, "but I also don't think we can be what we were. Too much has happened." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand, I want you to be happy, Michael, even if it's not with me." It was a painful admission, but it was one we both needed to hear. The love we once had was gone, replaced by something more fragile and fleeting, but that didn't mean we had to carry bitterness with us for the rest of our lives. "I want the same for you," I replied. "I really do." We sat there for a few more minutes, the silence between us no longer uncomfortable but peaceful. It felt like we had finally reached the end of a long and painful journey. There was no more anger, no more need for revenge, just acceptance. Eventually, Amy wiped her eyes and stood up, pulling her coat around her. "I should go. I've taken up enough of your time." I stood as well, offering her a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Amy." She smiled back, a little sadly. "You too, Michael." And with that she walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the cool autumn air. I watched her go, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. This was it, the closure I had been searching for. As I left the cafe and walked down the street, I realized that I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The past was behind me now, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever the future had in store. It was time to start living again. Time to move forward, and I knew that no matter what happened next, I was finally free. The sun was setting as I drove along the familiar road, the sky streaked with shades of pink and orange. It had been a few weeks since my meeting with Amy, and life had started to feel different, lighter, more open, like the world was finally ready to let me breathe again. The weight of the past no longer pressed on my chest, and the future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. I had spent the last few days packing up the house. It was time to move on, literally and figuratively. I'd found a place on the coast, a small town far enough from the memories that haunted me but close enough to remind me that I was still connected to the life I once knew. It was a fresh start, one that I needed more than I'd realized. I had said my goodbyes to Chris and Megan earlier that morning. They had been my anchors through everything, and while it was hard to leave them behind, I knew it was time. They understood that too, encouraging me to take this next step. We promised to stay in touch, and I knew we would. Real friends don't disappear no matter the distance. As I pulled into the driveway of my new home, I took a moment to take it all in. The house was small but cozy, nestled on a hill overlooking the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled the air, and a cool breeze swept through the trees. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I stepped out of the car and stretched, feeling the tension in my muscles ease as I breathed in the salty air. The moving truck was scheduled to arrive in a couple of hours, giving me time to explore my new surroundings. I walked around the property, taking in the sights and sounds, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. This place didn't carry the ghosts of the past, it was a blank canvas, ready for me to paint a new picture of my life. As I made my way back to the house, I noticed a figure standing on the porch. At first I thought it was one of the movers arriving early, but as I got closer I recognized the familiar face. "Jake," I said, surprised to see him here. Jake, one of my old friends who had distanced himself during the whole ordeal with Amy and Jack, smiled awkwardly. "Hey Michael, I heard you were moving out here. Thought I'd come by and see how you're doing." I hadn't expected to see him again. After everything that had happened, I assumed most of my old friends would want nothing to do with me. But seeing him here standing on my porch reminded me that not all bridges had been burned. "I'm doing okay," I replied, walking up to join him. "It's good to see you." Jake nodded, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Yeah, you too. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. Things got complicated." I understood what he meant. The fallout from Amy and Jack's affair had rippled through our friend group, and everyone had been forced to pick sides. Jake had chosen to stay out of it, which I didn't blame him for. But seeing him now, I realized that maybe it was time to rebuild some of those connections. "No hard feelings," I said, offering him a smile. It was a tough situation for everyone. He looked relieved, and we stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the waves in the distance. "This place suits you," Jake finally said, glancing around. "It's peaceful. That's what I was going for," I replied. "Needed a fresh start." Jake nodded. "I get that. We all need that sometimes." We talked for a while, catching up on what had happened in each other's lives since everything fell apart. It wasn't awkward or forced, it was just two old friends reconnecting. And as we stood there, I realized that maybe I didn't need to leave everything behind after all. Some things were worth holding on to, like the friendships that had weathered the storm. Eventually Jake said his goodbyes, promising to keep in touch. As he drove away, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The past was behind me, but not everything from that chapter of my life had to be lost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The stars began to appear one by one, twinkling in the vast expanse above. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the heartbreak, the anger, the need for revenge that had consumed me for so long. But those feelings were gone now, replaced by something far more powerful: acceptance. I had come to terms with what had happened, and in doing so, I had found a way to move forward. I wasn't the same person I had been before all of this, but that was okay. I was stronger now, more resilient, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it. As I sat there listening to the sound of the waves, I allowed myself to smile. This was my new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about what the future held. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. What mattered now was the path ahead, and I was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of seagulls outside my window. The light streamed in through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. For a moment, I just lay there, letting the tranquility of the morning sink in. No alarms, no pressing thoughts of what had been, just the sound of the ocean and the feeling of a new day beginning. After a quick breakfast, I decided to take a walk along the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet, and the waves gently lapped at the shore as I made my way down the coastline. The air smelled of salt and freedom, and I breathed it in deeply, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. As I walked, I thought about the past year, about everything that had happened with Amy and Jack, about the people I'd lost and the ones I'd found along the way. It felt like a lifetime ago now, even though the scars were still there, faint but lingering, but they didn't hurt as much anymore. They were just reminders of a chapter that had finally come to a close. The sound of laughter pulled me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see a group of kids playing by the water's edge, their parents sitting nearby on a blanket. It was a simple scene, but it made me smile. Life went on no matter what happened. People found ways to keep moving forward, to find joy in the little things. I had been so focused on the pain for so long that I had forgotten that. I continued walking, letting my mind wander. Eventually, I reached a small pier that jutted out into the ocean. I climbed up the weathered wooden steps and leaned against the railing, staring out at the endless expanse of water. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their rhythm steady and unchanging. It was then that I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a familiar face approaching, Stephen, the man who had become an unexpected ally during my quest for revenge. We had kept in touch after everything went down with Jack, checking in on each other from time to time. Seeing him here now, I wasn't entirely surprised. He had mentioned wanting to visit once I was settled in. "Didn't expect to see you so soon," I said as he walked up beside me, leaning against the railing with a grin. "Figured I'd take you up on that offer for a drink," Stephen replied, his tone light. But there was something in his eyes, an understanding that came from shared experiences. We both knew what it was like to rebuild after being torn down. "I'm glad you did," I said, meaning it. "How have you been?" He shrugged, looking out at the ocean. "Better. It's been a process, but I'm getting there. What about you? This place seems to suit you." "It does," I agreed. "I've been good, better than I've been in a long time." We stood there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the waves and letting the calmness of the moment settle over us. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that had once consumed our lives, and I was grateful for it. "Funny how things turn out," Stephen said after a while, his voice thoughtful. "A year ago I couldn't imagine feeling like this. Like there was hope again." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "It's amazing what time can do." He turned to me, a serious expression on his face now. "You know, Michael, we've been through a lot, but I think we both made it out stronger. Doesn't mean it was easy, but we're still here." "Yeah," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. "We are." There was a moment of mutual acknowledgement, a recognition of the paths we had both taken to get to this point. We didn't need to say much more. The bond we had formed was built on actions, not words. We both knew what it meant to come out the other side, scarred but still standing. Stephen clapped me on the shoulder, breaking the silence. "Come on, let's go get that drink. I think we've earned it." I smiled, grateful for the companionship. "Yeah, we have." As we walked back down the pier, I realized that this was what closure felt like. Not a dramatic moment of finality, but a quiet acceptance of what had been and what was yet to come. The echoes of the past were still there, but they no longer dictated my every move. I was free to live again, and I intended to make the most of it. We found a small beachside bar, the kind of place where the locals gathered after a long day. The sun was setting as we took a seat outside, the golden light casting long shadows across the sand. We ordered drinks, and as we sipped them, we talked about everything and nothing: sports, the weather, our plans for the future. It felt good to talk about the future again, to think about what might come next without the burden of the past weighing me down. I didn't know what was in store for me, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. As the night went on, I found myself laughing more than I had in years. It was a simple, easy laughter, the kind that came from being in good company and knowing that everything was going to be okay. The storm had passed, and now I was standing in the calm, ready to face whatever came my way. When the bar finally started to close up for the night, Stephen and I parted ways, promising to keep in touch. I walked back to my house under the stars, the cool night air filling my lungs. The world was quiet, and so was my mind. There were no more doubts, no more fears, just a sense of peace that I had been searching for all along. I stood on my porch for a while, looking out at the ocean. The waves were still crashing against the shore, their rhythm steady and unchanging. I knew that life would continue to bring its challenges, its ups and downs. But I also knew that I was ready for them. I was ready for whatever came next. As I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I knew that this was truly the beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write on my own terms with no regrets. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. I lay in bed, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was peaceful, almost surreal, like the calm after a storm. For the first time in what felt like forever, I woke up without a knot in my stomach, without the weight of the past pressing down on my chest. I got up slowly, savoring the quiet of the morning. Today felt different, lighter somehow. There were no plans, no schemes, no lingering bitterness. Just the promise of a new day, and the freedom to live it however I chose. I made a pot of coffee and took my mug out to the porch, settling into the old wooden chair that had quickly become my favorite spot. The ocean stretched out before me, vast and endless, its surface sparkling in the early light. The breeze was cool, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea. I took a deep breath, letting the freshness fill my lungs. Sitting there, I thought about how far I'd come. The anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge, they all seemed so distant now, like echoes of another life. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led me here, to this place of peace and clarity. I had let go of the past. It hadn't been easy, and there were still moments when the memories tried to creep back in, but they no longer had power over me. I had reclaimed my life piece by piece, and now I was ready to move forward. The knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, but this small coastal town had a way of drawing people in. Setting my coffee down, I got up and opened the door to find Chris and Megan standing on the porch, their smiles wide and warm. "Surprise," Megan said, holding up a bottle of wine. "We couldn't let you start this new chapter without a proper celebration." Chris grinned, clapping me on the back. "We missed you, man. Thought we'd come down and see how you're settling in." I felt a surge of gratitude. Despite everything that had happened, despite the distance I had put between us, they were still here, still my friends, still my support. It reminded me that even though I had started over, I didn't have to do it alone. "Come on in," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "You're just in time for coffee." We spent the morning catching up, laughing and reminiscing about old times. It felt good to be surrounded by people who knew me, and who had stood by me through the worst of it all. The conversation flowed easily, and before long, it felt like no time had passed at all. Later we took a walk along the beach, the three of us falling into the same easy rhythm we'd always had. As the day wore on, I realized just how much I had missed this, the simple joy of being with friends, of sharing stories and moments that didn't involve pain or betrayal. As the sun began to set, we returned to the house, where we opened the bottle of wine Megan had brought and toasted to new beginnings. The orange and pink hues of the sunset bathed us in warm light, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly content. "This place suits you, Michael," Chris said, raising his glass. "You seem different, happier." "I am," I replied, clinking my glass against theirs. "It took a while, but I finally feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be." Megan smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "We're proud of you, you know. You've been through a lot, but you've come out stronger." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words. "Thanks. It hasn't been easy, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The stars began to appear one by one, and the sound of the waves became the only noise around us. It was a perfect moment, one that I knew I would carry with me for a long time. Eventually, Chris and Megan decided it was time to head back to their hotel. We said our goodbyes, with promises to see each other soon. As I watched them drive away, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for their friendship, for this new life I had built, and for the journey that had brought me here. I stood on the porch for a while after they left, just taking it all in. The night was quiet, the air cool and crisp. I felt at peace, more so than I ever had before. This was my life now, a life I had fought for, a life that was mine to shape. The past no longer held me captive, and the future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. As I turned to go back inside, I knew that I was ready to embrace whatever came next, with no fear and no regrets. Just a deep, abiding sense of hope and the knowledge that, no matter what, I had made it through the storm. And now, it was time to live.